right, early voting for the March 3rd primary began last week and runs through February 27th. This year features several key local races such as county judge in Harris, Fort Bend, Galveston, Montgomery counties, as well as statewide contests, including one of Texas U.S. Senate seats. So to help us make sense of the races and propositions that Houston area residents will be voting on, we welcome Brandon Rottinghaus, professor of political science at the University of Houston and host of Party Politics. Brandon, welcome to Hello Houston. It sounds like you got to pack a lunch to get through this ballot.
You're definitely going to have to spend some time. Yes, bring an energy drink, bring something to snack on. Yeah, it's going to be a long one.
You know, Brandon, why do Texas primaries matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. The primaries matter in large part because this is the election that shapes the questions and nominees for who gets to be on the general election. And that means that effectively we're kind of winnowing through some of the questions and topics and candidates who are being considered for the next step. So this really does set up the kind of questions and candidates that are to be considered in the general election. So really it's a kind of pre-election, but in some cases it's almost like the real election because the way that the districts are drawn, the particular point of view and success that some candidates and parties have in particular counties means that whoever wins the primary is likely to win the general too. So it takes on added importance.
And how does turnout affect the primary? Because we see it's kind of a known fact that the March primaries usually have a very low turnout.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of people don't participate. There are a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, primary politics tends to be staffed by those people who are the most committed, the most hardcore partisans, and most voters aren't in that category. The other is that more elections means just more work to be done. Like Frank said, the ballot's really long. You've got lots of candidates to research. The cost of voting, in effect, then is going up. So people just don't participate in significant ways. In fact, most primaries, you see about 83 to 85% of the Texas electorate simply just doesn't vote. That number is obviously way too high. We'd like to get that down. But I will say in some elections like this one, you are seeing the turnout increase. And that does suggest that there's a kind of groundswell of support for candidates or for policies. And sometimes it just means people are downright mad and they want to see some change.
Yeah, well, I think the Senate race has lit a lot of fires. I mean, this is the most interesting Senate race we've seen in probably a very long time.
I think it's a great point. The fact that you're seeing this fireworks on both sides means that you're going to have a lot more engaged electorate. You're definitely seeing that on the Democratic side of things. Normally, it's the case that Republicans outvote Democrats statewide, basically 2-1. In this case, it's almost even. And in some places, like Harris County, like Dallas County, you're seeing a real spike in support for Democrats. So whether it translates into the success for Democrats in the general election, we don't know. But for sure, there's been a lot more primary activity. And that means, I think you're seeing people activated by what's going on in these campaigns.
And as Frank said, we're seeing obviously U.S. Senate, that's getting a lot of traction. But there's also some other major, statewide offices, including governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, which will all be on the March 3rd ballot. What can you tell us about those races and what you think people need to know about some of these other, maybe, I don't want to call them sleepers, but some of them that might feel like sleepers?
And while we're on that, we talked about a couple of weeks ago that you have to vote either Democrat or Republican, or I guess another party if another party is out there. So does that include the major state races?
Yeah, to answer your question fairly briefly, you have to pick a primary. Texas has open primaries in the sense that you can vote in either one without being a kind of quote unquote member of a party, but you've got to take your pick. So you can only vote for one slate and those candidates in running in those races. Now, in the general, it's different. Obviously, you can vote for whomever you want, but each of the parties will by then have a nominee that they've chosen for that office. So in that sense, too, you see kind of fewer people participating in primaries because they're really just not sure exactly who they like yet and wait to the general to kind of determine who they want to pick. But to Celeste's question, there are a lot of these issues and that a lot of these candidates that are really important. And this is something I think that we tend to forget. We tend to focus on these big hot button issues, right? The national Senate race here has implications for what goes on in the balance of power in DC, but the race for governor is equally important because the big policy issues like public education are definitely on the ballot. For lieutenant governor, that's an extremely important position. They have tremendous amount of authority at the legislative level in Texas, so that's a huge office. The controller is also also another one. You've got a pretty pitched battle there for who's going to be basically watching the state's bank account and certifying the budget for the legislature. So that's been a pretty competitive race too. Another one we don't talk about enough is the Attorney General's race. Really ugly politics happening in the Republican side of that race. The Democrats are also trying to face off and figure out who they think the best choice is to put the initiative for Democrats back into the Attorney General's office. So just a lot of things happening at the very top of the ballot and all the way down the ballot. Lots of congressional offices. Here in Harris County, we're voting on some important positions when it comes to the position of county judge. Both Republicans and Democrats have got a pretty sizable set of candidates running that could very well change the course of how Harris County functions.
What's your take on the Al Green race and Chris Menefee? Chris has done very well in the polls, whereas Al Green is sort of the incumbent that's always on the ballot. So where do you think this will end up going?
Yeah, they have different styles. I think generally speaking, they both feel the same. They're going to both vote the same. But it is a question of emphasis. It's also a question of just tactics. I think Al Green certainly has been that kind of old guard, kind of protest to politics style movement. And, Christian Menefee is more willing to kind of work on the operational side of things, to pursue lawsuits that can tangibly get things done. The voters obviously are going to have to make pretty tough choices since they're both good candidates. But we're seeing a real generational change here. And I think that the degree to which Democrats are really anxious to find new leadership will be very telling in this race.
And that's interesting, right? Because as Houstonians, we basically had a front row seat to really understand how redistricting, changes and can force adjustments within the party within itself. And are there any other examples of, kind of what happened at District 18 in Texas that we should be watching?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And obviously, as you imply, redistricting, shuffled the table a bit and kind of, if you have a big collection of Legos, you kind of have it in a box and you shake it up and pour it all out. It's harder to see what the big picture looks like at the end. But if you've got a roadmap and you've got a little bit of guidance, you can find that way. And that's what we're hoping voters do. Unfortunately, a lot of these changes means that voters are sometimes going to be confused about where to vote and how to vote. But obviously, those changes can be undone if you've got a good roadmap, and there are a lot of great resources out there, including Hello Houston, to help us through. But on your point about the how this is sort of being seen generationally, one consequence of redistricting is that you do see this change often happen. The 29th district is a good example of that here in Houston. This is a district represented by an incumbent, Democrat, and is being challenged by Jarvis Johnson. So Sylvia Garcia is the incumbent, and Jarvis Johnson is running against her with the kind of expectation that because the district changed, then they should change representation too. We'll see how that plays out. We're also seeing this play out in North Texas. This is the 32nd Congressional District. Julie Johnson is the incumbent, and Colin Allred, who is running for Senate and who ran for Senate last cycle, is in that race, and that'll be a telling indicator kind of where the Democratic Party is going. So there are all these races that are going to give us insight in terms of where the direction of the party goes and what kind of preferences voters have in terms of the kind of candidates they want to represent them.
Right. Now, Brandon, moving into policy issues and kind of voter priorities, what are some of the major policy issues driving voter interest that you all are seeing this season? Is it healthcare access? Oftentimes we know immigration is very top of mind. Is it education funding? What's kind of driving voters within this primary election?
Yeah, you've got your finger on the pulse, I think, of where the public is. They're definitely concerned about the bottom line. This is a pocketbook election, and that means that you're seeing voters really care about what's going to happen in those candidates' minds in terms of their policy preferences in affordability issues. It's been something that's driven more union officials to run. It's been driving that conversation about tariffs, which obviously the Supreme Court weighed in pretty significantly, and the president's going to have to talk about this week in the State of the Union. So there are definitely those issues, I think, that are most profound. And, we're used to seeing the incumbent party get a pretty good shellacking in a midterm. It's possible the Republicans could lose between 40 and 50 seats. If you just map out the number of those competitive seats, it's likely that they're going to take some big hits. And partly it's because of the economy, and the fact that the perception is that the administration didn't do enough to fix that is part of that story. But I think you're exactly right, too, beyond that these things are all interwoven with people's concerns about how international efforts are faring. There are definitely foreign policy questions that people are going to want to have answered in terms of what kind of resources are being spent on those things. Immigration is always a big issue. Border security was the number one issue in 24. It's still a huge issue, but definitely something that is modified and adapted a bit given the current circumstances.
Right. And, it's interesting that you mentioned affordability because, I never knew that our Texas Agricultural Commissioner, who is currently one of the seats that is on the ballot, is Sid Miller, and I interviewed him as well as his opponent Nate Sheets, and that's something that we discussed in ad nauseum about affordability and food affordability, and I don't realize that Texans can vote on that and understand that. And so it's like, as voters, we need to understand our district, what our district is, obviously the candidates, but also the issues.
I think that's great. No, totally. And the way that these candidates are positioning themselves in these races is oftentimes in a role of educating. They need to talk about what these offices do, what they can do, maybe what they're not doing if you're a challenger. So I think that's a great way to introduce people to government. That's why it's so important people understand the roles and functions of these different offices, because we should be holding them accountable for these things. And if we think they're not doing a good job, then we should definitely find somebody who we think can do a better job.
My British computer guy asked on YouTube, I'm curious to hear from Brandon if we're seeing any poll numbers yet.
There have been polling numbers in a bunch of races. Certainly in Harris County, we've got some pretty good polling that looks at some of the races and state of the races. It's worth keeping in mind that these polls are just snapshots. It's also really hard to poll in primaries. It's a challenge to get a sense of who's really going to come out to vote because, like I said earlier, the number of people who actually vote is pretty small. So we generally have better success polling in a general election, which means you're going to find a bit better of opportunity to kind of really get a sense of what people are after. We are seeing a lot of polling on the statewide Senate race. That's obviously become a national story. Like I said, this is a important position because the balance of power in the Senate is really in effect. There was a sense basically 2 years ago that the Republicans were going to hold the Senate and maybe even pick up seats. Now there's a chance that they might not hold the Senate. And if Texas flips, then you're definitely going to see a crack in that Republican armor, and it'll be an international story beyond that. So long story short, we're seeing a lot of polling from a lot of different places. I caution people not to look at any one poll as being definitive. This is a rolling average of polls that we should really care about because, like I said, every poll is really just giving us kind of one momentary snapshot of what's going on in the electorate.
We're speaking with Brandon Rottinghaus, professor of political science at the University of Houston, about the primary election. If you'd like to join the conversation, call or text us at 713-440-8870.
Now, Brandon, while national races aren't on this ballot, how do you think they, or lack thereof, essentially shape the Texas primaries? Do national political dynamics reflect kind of broader national partisan trends and frustrations when people are going to vote?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I definitely see that happening, and certainly the kind of issues that are getting discussed are being indexed into the topics that the candidates are talking about here. Sometimes that can be successful, where if you're talking about something that's globally important, then definitely it's something that our national leaders should be having a conversation about. Affordability is a great example. Immigration is another one. The question about tariffs obviously is honed in this too. So there are a lot of things people should care about, but the real issue, I think, for most Texans is how does it affect them? So having the discussion be about these niche issues that are only of interest to DC politico types isn't going to help move the needle. And both parties have really struggled to find a way to balance this sort of support from their base who have very particular political perspectives and the kind of average, kind of voter who may not care about politics, but definitely cares about whether something is affordable and definitely is worried about the state of foreign policy and, worried about how the border is being secured. So there's a balance there that has to be met. And candidates are always striving to find that. I think one trend we're seeing the last couple cycles is that the candidates who've done better have been the ones who seem authentic and can really talk to people about their issues. That trend, I think, is worth getting back to because it is the cornerstone of how representation functions. We should expect these politicians to talk to us about the things that we're really concerned about, not the things that their party's concerned about or that people online are concerned about, the people who are really in kitchen tables around the corners, looking for ways to try to make life better better. Those are the kind of politicians that need to be running and need to be talking about these things.
Speaking of affordability of the economy, I'm hearing that the State of the Union may really focus on economy, especially since not all the wars that we were promised would get fixed have been fixed. So what do you think about the State of the Union coming up, and where the Supreme Court justice is going to sit?
This is a great point, Frank. I love the State of the Union. It's like our Super Bowl and the World Series, like all rolled up into one, and every celebrity comes to watch it. So yes, I think you're onto something there. The question about where the court's going to sit has long puzzled the observers of American politics. It always seems odd that the court comes to watch. Maybe this will be the last time, to be honest, that we see that happen, given that the friction is very real. So we'll see how that gets played out. And obviously the awkwardness can sometimes be fun to watch, like watching a reality TV show kind of spin off the rails. But I think President Trump for sure has got some objectives he's got to meet. He has to talk about affordability. It's the one liability that the Republicans have. He's got to talk about tariffs, because think about this. What he's doing essentially is to evoke legislation that gives the president the power to be able to change tariffs for 150 days. Then Congress has to vote. So he's got to use this as a platform to talk a lot about what Congress can expect. He also needs to brag a bit about what the economy is doing that is successful, the parts that have been going well, especially some of the things Republicans want him to brag about with respect to the big, beautiful bill. So there are a lot of things he's got to accomplish in this speech. He's got to be on message. We know Trump has a tendency to kind of meander a little bit. Some of that is appealing to the base, but if he wants to really get a big swath of the American people back on his side, he's going to have to talk about those core issues and sell it well.
Brandon Rottinghaus is a professor of political science at the University of Houston and host of Party Politics. Brandon, thanks for joining us today on Hello Houston.
Thanks, Celeste. Thanks, Frank.